Greetings everyone. Hope everyone's safe and well. Today we'll be talking crosswind landing technique in DCS and we'll be focusing on the A-10C. Before I get started, I should point out that I'm not actually an A-10C pilot. I've never been in the military and I'm not a flight instructor, although I would like to be at some point. I've just been a private pilot for the last 10 years and flying sims for the better part of 25 or 30 years. And that kind of leads me to the main problem with skills and sim pilots, and that most sim pilots, and this may be stating the obvious, have not had standardized flight training. Um, and then on top of that, DCS and a lot of sims have and encourage the use of multiple aircraft types. So it's hard to learn skills in a standardized way when you're juggling different aircraft from one day to the next. And then on top of that, the skills and the muscle memory and perception that are necessary for judging crosswinds are tougher when you've got a flat screen, although this is mitigated to some degree by VR and track IR. So when we talk about what we actually want to accomplish in a crosswind landing, there are a number of goals that we have that we want to balance. We can't get all of these, but if we can keep all these problems to a minimum, then that might tell us which technique to use or how to land. Uh, Probably the most obvious one is we want to land on them in the middle of the runway. The farther you are from the edges of the runway, the more margin of error you have before you start eating grass on the side of the runway. We don't want to stress out the main gear by excessive side loads. If we land sideways, it tends to put a lot of stress on the main gear, and it's a good way of causing gear collapse. Um, they can take a certain amount, and some landing gear is actually beefier than others, but in the A-10C, landing gear is kind of tall and spindly. Uh, so, so the more we can land straight ahead, the better. We want to minimize the risk of loss of control. If the technique we use is tricky or tends to produce early stalls or ground loops, well, that's not ideal. We also want to decrease the risk of airframe damage. Some of the maneuvers we're going to talk about have you landing with a significant bank angle, and you could hit your wingtip and damage it. Um, and the one that is probably worth talking about the most is the need to minimize pilot workload. Um, it has to be a doable technique. If it takes so much technique and practice and you can only get it right 9 times out of 10 but not that 10th time, well, it's not really a great technique, is it? Especially since you want all your landings to work out. So let's talk about the things I want people to take away from this. First of all, yes, we're focusing on the A-10C. And we'll talk about the recommended and published procedures in the flight manual for the A-10C. But do realize that what we'll be talking about here is intended to be generalizable to all other aircraft. Yes, there are going to be exceptions, and if there are exceptions, because these are standard techniques, those should be spelled out in the flight manuals for each individual aircraft. Excuse me. The three techniques that are taught for crosswind landings are the side slip or the wing low approach to landing, the crab to side slip landing, and the crab landing. We'll do demonstrations of all of them. The skills and the muscle memory that people need to practice to build these techniques include the ability to establish the correct wind correction angle or crab angle, the ability to perform side slips to a proper degree, the ability to manage your descent angle, since some of that can change in these techniques, and the ability to maintain control on the landing rollout. When we talk about a wind correction angle or crab angle, this skill is generally called crabbing. The goal is to establish enough of a wind correction angle that the aircraft tracks the runway center line. In this case, we've got a crosswind from the right. The aircraft is pointing to the right, but it's tracking the runway center line. It's pointed to the right just enough to cancel out any left and right movement off the runway center line. We make corrections and we maintain the center line by changing heading with normal or bank turns. We don't use the rudder. We just use our normal left and right turns like we would if there was no crosswind. The main difference is that you're to some degree going to be looking out the side window while you're tracking the runway center line, and that tends to make people a little uncomfortable if they've never done that before. This is particularly apparent when you're using VR. That sense of looking out the side window and tracking the runway takes some getting used to, but once it clicks, it's not terribly difficult, because this approach, like I said, is just straight in normal flight, like with a regular approach without a crosswind. On the other hand, the side slip is a maneuver to keep the plane aligned with the runway and on the runway center line. Instead of compensating for the crosswind by pointing into the wind, we compensate for the crosswind by banking into the wind. The problem with banking into the wind is that if you didn't do anything else, the plane would start turning to the right. So to keep the plane from turning to the right, you put in enough left rudder to keep the heading from changing. And once you do that, if you've got the right amount of bank, the plane should remain on the runway center line, and it should remain pointed down the runway center line. The way a lot of instructors will teach this is that you use the rudder to align with the runway, and you use your bank angle to correct the amount of left and right drift from the runway center line. This cross-controlled maneuver, where you have, in this case, right aileron and left rudder, will actually produce, in a sense, flying sideways. The plane will be flying sideways into the wind, just enough to cancel out the crosswind. The problem with flying sideways is that because your fuselage is facing the airstream, you have more drag. And so you need to increase the power, and sometimes to a significant degree, to maintain the correct descent angle. It's also important to realize that this bank angle, because you've got the left rudder pedal held down, as long as you have left rudder in, the plane will tend to roll to the left. And so you actually can't just set this bank angle and then let go of the stick. You need to keep the ailerons to the right throughout the entire maneuver just to maintain this bank angle. And it's going to feel like a balancing act. After your three wheels are on the ground, your job is not done. And in fact, many accidents tend to occur in crosswinds once the airplane's on the ground because people relaxed and let go of the controls. You got to realize that crosswinds will tend to do crosswinds will tend to cause three problems once you're on the ground. They tend to push the aircraft sideways downwind, so the plane will try to slide to the right. At the same time, the plane will try to turn to the left. With a crosswind coming from the left, the nose will come around and try to turn to face the wind. This effect's called weather vaning for obvious reasons, and it can feel pretty strange. This movement of sliding to the right but turning to the left. The third problem the crosswind will cause is lifting the upwind wing. If the crosswind's strong enough, or if you're still moving forwards fast enough, the left wing will produce a little more lift than the right. And if the left wing's producing enough wing, it'll actually be enough to lift that left wing and tip the plane over. In fact, once the wing starts lifting up, it actually produces more lift, and it'll accentuate that tipping over effect. So after the wheels touch down, you want to maintain proper inputs. You want to keep the ailerons into the wind to some degree. In other words, left aileron in this case. And you want to keep some amount of rudder away from the wind, right rudder in this case. These will counteract the lifting and turning effect that the crosswind causes. The only thing we can do to prevent the plane being pushed sideways is to ensure that we have enough weight on the wheels. If you have enough weight on the wheels, that will produce enough rolling friction to keep the plane from being pushed to the right downwind. Okay, so let's move into some demonstrations here. All these demonstrations will be in the A-10C. It'll be with a fairly light load, 3,000 pounds of fuel and no ordnance. And it should be worth noting that the effects of the crosswind are accentuated by light loading. We'll start on a long final into Caballetti, the field elevation 59 feet MSL, so pretty close to sea level. We'll be landing runway 7 with winds out of the north at 18 knots. That's pretty much a direct left crosswind. Our approach speeds will, for the most part, be somewhere between 120, 130 knots. Okay, here we are on that long final into Caballetti. The crosswind's coming from the left. You can't see the runway. The runway is behind that pedestal, but if I slide over to the right, you can see the runway. In fact, I'll slide over to the right enough you can kind of see both the velocity vector and the runway. Note that the velocity vector here has that little arrow pointing to the right, which means the velocity vector is actually off the right side of the HUD, the displayable area on the HUD. So we're going to try to track the runway center line from Caballetti, and if you sort of visually follow out the runway center line, it should be pointing somewhere in this direction. So we're a little to the right of runway center line. So I made a slight turn to the left, and I'll show the controls here. And now as we get back on the runway center line, I'll turn to the right again. Notice I'm not using any rudder pedals. These are just normal left and right banks to correct our heading. You'll also notice there's this little building here on the runway center line, and that helps us visually think of where that extended runway center line is so that we can stay on it. Okay, so as we get closer, around under 400 feet, we'll transition to the side slip, and here we go. So you can see I'm feeding in right rudder, but because I'm now level with the right rudder, I started drifting off to the right, so I compensate for that with a left bank. Really, it would make sense to do both at the same time once you get used to this skill. So I'll pause it here, and you can see here that although we've got this left crosswind from the left direction, the velocity vector is on the runway. We're banked to the left, but we're keeping in that right rudder to keep our nose aligned with the runway. And so this is the picture I want to keep as we're touching down, all the way to the point of touchdown, even during the flare. As I pull up the nose a little bit to decrease our descent rate, we'll want to keep this bank angle. And we'll actually touch down on the left wheel first, and then the right, and then we'll keep the nose up in the air until we're ready to let it down. So the flare here, we'll touch down on that left wheel first, then the right wheel. Now that the wings are level, we've got to readjust our rudder pedal and keep that right rudder to keep us rolling down the runway center line. As we get slower, the rudders will become less effective, and I'll need to feed in more and more right rudder to keep us rolling down the center of the runway. And then at some point when I switch on the nose wheel steering, you're going to have to recenter the rudder pedals really fast. Once the nose wheel steering is engaged, then you need much less right rudder pedal. And if you get the timing wrong, you get that little wobble there. Okay, so on the brakes, and we'll turn off at the end of the runway here. Okay, so that was an example of the side slip to landing. We kept that left wing low the entire time, all the way through the flare and through touchdown. And then once we were on the ground, we maintained control during the landing rollout by keeping left aileron and right rudder in throughout the roll. Okay, and just for a different perspective, we'll look at this landing from outside. Of note, contrails are modeled incorrectly in DCS. Those contrails really should just be coming straight back from the plane. Okay, so here we transition from the crab into the side slip. We use the rudder to keep the nose aligned with the runway, and we bank to the left enough to keep from drifting to the right. You can see I have drifted a little to the right of the runway, but we'll compensate for that as we get closer. Okay. And as we get through the landing flare here, we'll touch left gear first, then right gear. And then we'll keep the nose up until we're ready to let it down. Okay, so one of the difficulties with the side slip approach to landing is that holding that side slip for a significant amount of time is actually pretty work intensive. You have to bet you're balancing two control surfaces at the same time, and you also have to adjust your throttle to compensate for the increased drag. One way of simplifying that process is to fly the crab down the approach until a later point and then transition to the side slip when you're pretty low to the ground, maybe within 100 feet of the ground, right before you actually start right before during you start your landing flare. And so this minimizes the amount of time that you're actually in the flare. And on top of that, because you already are reducing your power to idle, you you don't need to really think about power changes to compensate for the side slip. So we'll take this approach down. I think I start the side slip maneuver really at the flare in this landing here. So you can see here that for the time being we're continuing the crabbed approach. We're down to about 550 feet here. The previous approach we started our side slip around 450 feet. In this case we're just going to continue the crabbed approach through that altitude all the way down to the landing flare. You can see on the controls there's no rudder being applied so far, and we're just tracking that runway center line out the side window. I wandered a little to the left here, so I had to correct to the right. Again, tough to see the runway behind that pedestal, but with VR you just tilt your head and look out there. And so you can see there right around 120 feet, maybe within 100 feet of the ground, I started the side slip maneuver, landed on left gear first, and then the right gear, and then let the nose come down when I'm ready. Okay, and then during the landing rollout, I keep a little bit of left aileron, a little bit of right rudder to keep us on the ground and on center line. And as we slow down, more and more right rudder until I finally turn on the nose wheel steering and then wobble around like a drunk man because I didn't catch it in time. Okay, so we just saw the crab to side slip landing where we transition to the side slip about 100 feet off the ground as we're starting the flare. This time we're going to do a variant of that where we're going to again fly the crabbed approach down pretty low, but this time we're going to delay the side slip maneuver so long that it only happens within a couple feet of the ground. So last time we did it around 100 feet off the ground. This time it will literally be a foot or two off the ground. Now the reason why you might do this is that because you're so close to the ground, the left main gear will hit the ground, or basically you'll land the left main gear on the ground before the plane has had a chance to bank very much to the left. And you might need to do this if you have a plane where you're worried about hitting the wingtip, or if you have big explodey things hanging off the bottom of the left wing. The A-10 has a pretty good wing dihedral. In other words, the wings tilt up at this angle from the fuselage, and so you've got a pretty good amount of bank angle to play with. But in other aircraft, this might be an issue. So we'll watch this. We'll watch this approach again. We'll stay in this crabbed approach almost all the way to the ground, and just before the wheels are about to touch, we'll enter that left side slip. I'll put the controls up so you can see it again. Okay, so here we are 100 feet off the ground, 50 feet, 40, 30, 20, 10, and here comes a side slip maneuver, and bam, the left wheel touches down, and we've landed the plane without really ever developing that much bank angle during the slip. Again, because it happened so late. And this last approach will be the third technique. It'll be a crabbed landing, and in this technique we're actually going to touch down while still in the crab. Yes, this does put significant side loads on the gear, but because it's a dynamic process, we can get away with it if we yank the nose to align with the runway immediately after touchdown. If we take too long, then the side loads can develop enough where it actually does cause damage to the landing gear if the crab angle is large enough. But if we yank the nose around to the right just after the main gear touches down, then we should be able to minimize any kind of risk of damage to the main gear. So the approach will be exactly the same as the crab to side slip technique, with the only exception that we never actually will have any kind of slip. We'll just touch down with the nose pointed off to the left in the crab angle, and only after we see or hear the main gear touch down do we yank the nose to the right in a authoritative maneuver. Not necessarily stabbing at the rudder pedals, but a authoritative rudder input to line the nose up. Now, one downside and one reason I don't see this recommended for the A-10 is that, aside from the fact that the A-10 can land in a bank fairly well, is the fact that the SAS actually prevents you from putting in that rapid rudder input. So this probably wouldn't work for big crosswinds. So you can see here, only after the main gear touch down do I pull the nose around with that right rudder. So how do we think about all these different techniques that I've just demonstrated? Well, it's actually a lot easier to think of them as all the same technique. And they all, to some degree, are the same. They only really differ in terms of when you transition from the crabbed approach to cross controls. All the techniques start out with a crabbed approach. You might transition to the cross control setup earlier or later, even just right after touchdown. The difference in when you might decide when to do that is that the earlier transition increases your workload, but it does increase your margin for error because you're not making any changes close to the ground. Doing the later transition is generally simpler. It decreases your workload. The crabbed approach is quite easy, but it decreases your margin for error because you have to make a substantial change right before or even right after touchdown, and the margin for error in terms of timing can be pretty small. But all the techniques end the same way. They all end with you in the landing rollout with cross controls to maintain directional control. So if we talk about the A-10C specifically, if you go to the A-10C-1 flight manual, this is all taken from that document. They do make a specific recommendation about landing technique. Their recommendation is to establish a combination of crab into the wind and wing low, and then shortly prior to the flare, rudder input should be increased to align the fuselage. In other words, you start out with kind of a partial side slip but you still have some crab angle. And then shortly before touchdown, you transition to the full side slip to fully compensate for the crosswind. Their explanation was that if you just use the crabbed approach to landing, the runway is maybe so far off to the side that you can't see it. And we saw that in our approaches where that HUD pedestal blocks the runway as you're approaching, and can make visibility difficult. They pointed out that touching down in a slight crab is acceptable up to 10 degrees, as long as you correct for it afterwards. They also pointed out that the nose wheel steering, when you engage, it can produce a sudden transient if you've got the rudder pedal down. So remember to let go of the rudder pedal right before you engage nose wheel steering. They pointed out that large aileron deflection during the rollout is generally not required because of the wide main gear track. So even though I've told you keep that left aileron or the upwind aileron in during the landing rollout, with the A-10 specifically, not as big a deal. I still keep in a small amount of aileron just to get in the routine of that for when I'm transitioning to other aircraft. But in the A-10, you get a lot of leeway there. They do point out, though, that the SAS will counter the attempt to kick out the crab angle with rapid rudder movement. So if you think about that, that really does kind of limit the helpfulness of that last technique where you kick out the crab after touchdown. Their suggestion is that, well, if you're gonna correct the crab angle, do so with gradual progressive rudder input. But like I said, in that technique, the rudder input has to be authoritative, fairly rapid. So that's kind of a gotcha there, and you got and it does limit how much you can really use that last technique. Okay, so here's the last approach, and this will be using the technique recommended in the A-10C flight manual, which is the combination crab and partial side slip prior to landing, and then shortly before landing transitioning to a full side slip to cancel out the crosswind. Let me turn on the controls so you can see. Okay, so here we're trying to get lined up with the runway. Okay, and about 350 feet off the ground, we do a partial side slip. We cancel out some of the crosswind with the side slip, but we keep we keep enough crab angle to stay on the runway center line, and then only within 100 feet of the ground do we transition to the full side slip with the full bank and land in that configuration. And so again, we land left wheel first, maintain runway center line. We've got the left aileron, right rudder as we roll out. So in conclusion, the way I suggest thinking about it is that all these techniques, they're really all the same idea. The only difference is when you make that transition to cross controls, and then you end up the same way. Your landing job isn't done until you are fully stopped. Maintain directional control on rollout with the correct control inputs. Practice, practice, practice. Getting the correct crab angles in crosswinds, and practice side slips. Both of these require visual and muscle memory, and they're not generally situations or techniques that sim pilots are put into to practice a lot. And they're both required for good crosswind landing techniques, so practice them. And lastly, check out your aircraft flight manual for gotchas and caveats to the standard techniques, because it's likely there will be some, and some of them may be pretty important. So I hope people found this helpful and enjoyable. If you've stayed with me to this point, thank you. Questions or comments, put them in the comments below, and everyone stay healthy and safe out there.